We know that the American Revolution created a republic that by 1820 was the most democratic country in the world and a source of inspiration to revolutionaries everywhere. Most of the American leaders of the 1770s had no intention of bringing about that situation. From the Stamp Act crisis to the Declaration of Independence, many of them justified their conduct as an attempt to preserve their traditional English liberties against a king and a ministry that they believed were threatening innovations that would make them tyrannical. When Patrick Henry declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," he was appealing explicitly to a long British tradition of liberty under limited government, the heritage of the Glorious Revolution. Many of the American leaders saw themselves more as restorationists than as revolutionaries, even when they came to believe that only independence would enable them to restore the conditions of the old order. They did not anticipate, and often did not relish, the drastic internal changes that followed from their victory. Well, if the leaders were not, in most cases, full-blown revolutionaries, how much less so were the Americans who favoured loyalty to the British cause, fought on the British side, and went into exile when the war was won and lost. These loyalists, aptly nicknamed Tories, are probably the least known major group in American history, but their story is integral to the history of Anglo-American conservatism. I think it's a great anomaly, actually, in the study of American history. Everyone would think it was very odd in a study of the American Civil War not to include the story from the Confederate point of view, but hardly anybody seems to think it odd not to include the Loyalists in studies of the Revolution, except as two-dimensional bad guys. There were a lot of them. Many of them were highly respected people who played an important role in American society up to the time of the war and in the early years of the conflict, and yet now they've been very, very largely forgotten. It's even possible to make the argument that the American Revolutionary War was really more of a civil war than the event we remember as the American Civil War, because there was far more geographical intermixing of loyalists and revolutionaries during the Revolution than there was at the time of the Civil War, where there was actually a very sharp geographical separation. Ex-Confederates called it the war between the states, and in some ways that's a more suitable name for the conflict of the 1860s. Well, historians have long debated whether the events of the 1770s and 80s should be thought of chiefly as a war of independence or as a revolution. It certainly wasn't the same kind of shattering social transformation as took place in France a few years later, or as took place in Russia in and after 1917. The American Revolution was procedural. It was orderly. It was led mainly by lawyers and merchants and planters, all men of property who were very, very attentive to the preservation of their own favoured situation. Now, clearly there are some elements of the American Revolution which do have a radical flavour. Contract theories of government. The work of John Locke was very influential to many of the American revolutionaries. And some clearly radical figures were at work. Samuel Adams, one of the leaders of the Boston revolutionaries, who organised the Boston Tea Party, mob actions and intimidations of undecided citizens. The work of Tom Paine was obviously very important. I mentioned him in each of the last two lectures as the author of Common Sense, the pamphlet which inspired the writing, or helped to inspire the writing, of the Declaration of Independence. But there's also a great deal of conservatism about the American Revolution, and it's possible to argue that in the Constitution it was that kind of conservatism which won out in the long run. Now, in the escalating crises of the 1760s and 70s, the American colonial leaders argued that their rights and liberties as Britons were under threat from an innovating king. They venerated the Glorious Revolution just as much as most Englishmen. Here's the historian Edmund Morgan, who writes, "Being English meant having a history that stretched back continuously into a golden age of Anglo-Saxon purity and freedom. It was a past in which freedom, born among the Anglo-Saxons, was submerged by the Norman conquest and only gradually recovered, the final triumph occurring in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Even those parts of English history that had occurred since the founding of the colonies were cheerfully appropriated, and in the ensuing years of strife with the mother country, there was no repudiation of the heritage. Throughout the war and after, Americans maintained that they were preserving the true tradition of English history, a tradition that had been upset by forces of darkness and corruption in England itself. The American revolutionaries identified closely with the opposition Whigs in England, who'd criticised the Hanoverian kings and criticised the Prime Minister Robert Walpole in just the same kind of way as had Bolingbroke and other critics of George I, II and III. They idolised the Glorious Revolution, and they were very, very suspicious of royal innovations. One source of particular resentment was the way in which Walpole had used patronage to buy the compliance of important parts of the nation, particularly the rising merchant classes. The American colonial leaders felt that the royal government was doing the same thing by appointing royal governors and judges and customs officials, all of whose livelihoods were directly dependent on the goodwill of the monarchy itself. And there was that old fear, which I mentioned in the context of Burke and Pitt, that luxury might sap the citizens' virtue. Now, the Stamp Act was particularly offensive. The Stamp Act is usually the event which marks the beginning of the revolutionary ferment of the 1760s. It was particularly offensive to the American colonists because they were denied the chance to participate in assigning taxes that they would have to pay. This is where we first start hearing the phrase, no taxation without representation. A petition from the colony of Massachusetts said that the Stamp Act deprived them of the most essential rights of Britons. They admitted that Parliament had the right to create duties to regulate trade and to oversee the welfare of the whole British Empire. But they denied that Parliament had the right to impose duties whose function was to raise revenue, because that would strike at the safety of their own property. I should just digress for a moment here to say that from the British government's point of view, they were doing something very reasonable, because the French and Indian War had just come to a highly satisfactory conclusion. The menace of French conquest had suddenly diminished sharply because now the British were the dominant power in Canada. And the British took the view, we've made the situation so much safer for the Americans, but it's cost us greatly. Surely it's reasonable for us to ask them to contribute to paying for it, to pay off some of the debts of the war. But the Americans, because they weren't represented, didn't see it that way. The colonists claimed that their colonial assemblies, under the king, played the same role for them as did Parliament under the king in England. This is one of the great ironies of the events which led up to the Declaration of Independence. To quote Edmund Morgan, the historian again, he says, "As they prepared to cast off the authority of Parliament, Americans were genuinely eager to keep their grip on the past. They had ransacked English and colonial history for precedents to justify their constitutional position, to show that they were still true to the traditions of Englishmen. And they had been remarkably successful in finding the precedents they wanted." Now, among the colonial leaders, there was a great interest in classical models, both in England and in America. There's a constant looking back to great earlier periods in the past, and particularly looking back to Greek and Roman heroes. One of the most popular figures in the 18th century on both sides of the Atlantic was the austere classical hero Cato, a Roman and a Stoic, famous for his absolute moral rectitude in an age of corruption, and as one of the defenders of the Republic, the Roman Republic, against the usurpation of Caesar. Joseph Addison had written a famous play called Cato, which was first staged in 1713. And it was its first performance was a famous moment in England because it was a veiled attack on royal corruption. And it appealed to the colonists for the same reason. George Washington, among many others, knew the play well, quoted it often, and had it performed at Valley Forge during the desperate winter of 1777, when the Continental Army was beleaguered there. So these are the American revolutionaries appealing to an ancient tradition of citizens' virtue. One of the puzzles for historians is that even after the fighting began at Lexington and Concord in April of 1775, another 15 months went by, during which, although they were fighting against British troops, the Americans continued to say that they were fighting for their rights as Englishmen. It wasn't until July 1776 that they finally wrote and endorsed the Declaration of Independence. So in that period of more than a year, The revolutionaries claimed that they were fighting for their rights as Englishmen over against a corrupt ministry which has deceived the king. They sent the olive branch petition to George III, appealing against his corrupt ministry. I think that suggests that at every step of the way, they acted as reluctant revolutionaries. Now, among the leaders of the revolutionary forces, John Adams, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton did not believe in equality or democracy, just as their English counterparts did not. Washington, in fact, modelled himself on another classical hero, Cincinnatus. Cincinnatus was famous for being called from the plough when the Roman Republic was in danger, fighting successfully as a general against Rome's enemies, but when the enemies were defeated and he had the opportunity to make himself into a tyrant, surrendered power and went back to his farm, back to the plough. And Washington was very self-conscious in modelling himself upon this classical hero, Cincinnatus, and was proudest in his own career, first of giving up power when he surrendered the Continental Army at the end of the Revolutionary War, and then again at the end of his second term as president in 1796, in giving up power. That is, the relinquishing of power is the great act for a virtuous citizen, because it prevents the danger that a military strongman will seize power and turn himself into a tyrant or a dictator. But here again, they're constantly looking backwards for inspiration, not forwards. All the Virginia leaders, including Washington, were aware of the paradox that they as slaveholders were fighting to prevent their enslavement by a tyrannical king. Now, in 1913, a historian named Charles Beard did a close study of the material interests of the Founding Fathers and came to the conclusion that most of them had been fighting for very obvious selfish reasons. He even claimed that the book was called An Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. And he said that they were mainly men of property who were afraid that they had a lot to lose if the British government could make arbitrary incursions against their property. And it's an influential study. But the prevailing wisdom now among historians is that Beard told a kind of half-truth. They were the pillars of society, these men, and they did have a lot to lose. But nevertheless, they believed in their rights as Englishmen, and they risked their lives on behalf of these rights. To participate in a revolution is, of course, one of the most dangerous things you can possibly do, because to be defeated would almost certainly mean execution for treason. I'd like to say a word now about the Loyalists. Loyalists made up about 500,000 people, or about 1/5 of the white colonists of North America. There were a lot of them, and they were important people. They identified emotionally and materially with Britain, and they continued to do so even after the outbreak of the fighting and even after the Declaration of Independence, because they thought it was unjustified. Here's the historian William Nelson in a study of the Loyalists. He says, "In and around the seaboard towns, 2 or 3 generations of successful commercial intimacy with Europe had produced a class of merchants and professional men with genteel aspirations and a cosmopolitan outlook. These people may have been increasingly estranged from the life of rural America, but they were less remote from England in fact and feeling than in earlier times. They found much to admire in the social and political system of 18th century Britain. They envied the easy and efficient intimacy between wealth and government in England, and sought to reproduce it in America." One of these men was Joseph Galloway of Pennsylvania, a loyalist who's been to some extent overlooked by the historians. His hope in the 1760s and 70s was to create even closer ties between Britain and America rather than to sunder them. One of his close friends was Benjamin Franklin, the leading citizen of Philadelphia. And both of them shared the view that Pennsylvania ought to be taken over as a royal colony away from the Quaker proprietors who'd founded it in the first place, and whom they found very irksome because of the Quakers' refusal to fight, even when they were under attack on the frontier by Indians. Galloway was afraid of the rough Scotch-Irishmen on the Pennsylvania frontier. He supported the idea of giving America members of Parliament to strengthen the ties between the two countries. All his instincts were for compromise and to prevent conflict. When the fighting broke out, it was easy for Galloway to stay with the British. When the British Army took over Philadelphia, he became its governor. When they evacuated, so did he. And he lived out his life in England, condemned in his absence by the Americans as a traitor to the revolutionary cause, and had his estates confiscated. Another good example would, again, very closely, even more closely associated with Benjamin Franklin, would be Franklin's son, William, who also became and remained a loyalist. William Franklin was born in 1731 and worked as an assistant to his father in the famous experiments with electricity, the kite experiments. He spent long periods studying in England and living there, and he felt himself to be an Englishman, whichever side of the Atlantic he might be on. Benjamin Franklin himself, who was slow to become a revolutionary, petitioned in London in the 1760s for his son to get the job of governor of New Jersey, and he got the job. When the war broke out, William Franklin responded by remaining loyal to the British. He was imprisoned by the revolutionary government from 1776 to 8, later released and went to New York, and from there migrated back to England and lived out the rest of his life there. Now, many of the Loyalists denied the intellectual claims being made by the revolutionaries. They didn't think that the revolutionaries had accurately interpreted the British tradition of limited government, and they certainly didn't think that the Americans were justified in rebelling. Here's Charles Inglis, one of the most articulate of the Loyalists. He wrote a pamphlet called The True Interest of America Impartially Stated. And this is an answer to Tom Paine's Common Sense, which was written during the lead-up to the Declaration of Independence, the pamphlet war of 1776. He explicitly denied the idea that man originally lived in the state of nature and said, no, we're born into society, we're born into families. He agreed with Richard Hooker, whom I mentioned back in the second lecture of this course, that God himself has placed men in society. Society needs laws, and law needs government. And government's not some kind of necessary evil, as Tom Paine implied, but a positive good ordained by God himself. Another of these pamphleteers was Samuel Seabury, author of The Letters of a Westchester Farmer, which is another of the best remembered of the Loyalist tracts. He warned New Yorkers that busybody revolutionary committee men, many of them born in the lowest social classes, were now going to seize power in the revolutionary committees and were going to regulate the details of citizens' lives, sometimes even breaking in their homes to make sure that, for example, they weren't drinking tea or other prohibited commodities. And Seabury says, will you submit to them, should they be chosen by the weak, foolish, turbulent part of the country people? Do as you please, but by him who made me, I will not. No, if I must be enslaved, let it be by a king, at least, and not by a parcel of upstart, lawless committee men. If I must be devoured, let me be devoured by the jaws of a lion, and not gnawed to death by rats and vermin. You can see the intensity of this rhetoric, the idea that the common people of New York State are rats and vermin. Despicable people, and he's saying they're going to start pushing into your affairs and denying you the elementary privacy that you've always enjoyed under the British. Now, quite a lot of people in America owed their livelihood directly to the British government. Those who were officials or state governors or very often Anglican clergymen were directly dependent on British patrons for their livelihood. Anglican clergy, such as Jonathan Boucher, were prominent conservative loyalists, as you might expect. Now, the Anglican clergy had been struggling for the appointment of a bishop in the 1750s and 60s. Each minister of the Church of England has to be anointed by a bishop, and that meant that because there wasn't a bishop in America, each of them had to take the very, very hazardous trip back to Britain in order to be ordained. But there'd been a lot of fear in the colonies that an Anglican bishop would be the beginnings of an attempt to deny religious freedom to the other religious groups, and particularly in New England, which had strong Puritan populations. It was feared in the same way that Archbishop Laud had been feared as a repressive Archbishop of Canterbury before the English Civil Wars. So to the annoyance of many of the Anglican clergy, a bishop had never been appointed. Boucher was an Anglican minister in the colonies since 1759. He was a close friend of George Washington, and in fact for a while he was the teacher of George Washington's stepson, John Parke Custis. By the early 1770s, as the revolutionary movement was gaining steam, he was the vicar of St. Barnabas's Church in Upper Marlborough, Maryland. He revived the old arguments of Sir Robert Filmer, one of the defenders of absolute monarchy, who, again, denied the idea that men once lived in a state of nature. Filmer's idea, which is echoed by Boucher, is that authority grows from patriarchy, that the basic institution of society is the family. And just as the father is the head of the family, so the king is the head of the much larger family, which is the nation itself, the kingdom itself. Once again, he's rejecting these contract theories of government, such as that of John Locke, and of course has good historical evidence to support his position. And emphatically, Boucher is denying the principle of individualism. He asks the question, what is society for? It's not for the good of man, but for the glory of God. Of course, as soon as you think that, that's necessarily going to change the way in which you think about the proper constitution of society. As the crisis worsened in 1773-4, he started preaching with a pair of pistols in the pulpit. You can imagine how engaging it must be to listen to the minister with the knowledge that he might aim a pistol at you. He preached his farewell sermon in 1775 after the fighting had begun to a divided congregation, some of whom sympathised with his loyalist position and some of whom definitely favoured the revolutionary position. But he ended by saying, "I will continue to pray for the king and all who are in authority under him. As long as I live, I will proclaim, God save the king." Perhaps the most famous of all the loyalists was Thomas Hutchinson, the last royal governor of the Massachusetts colony. And he was in the embarrassing and awkward position of deploring the British government's conduct in the 1760s and 70s, but nevertheless still remaining loyal to it. His view was that, though it was mistaken, nevertheless that didn't justify him in rebelling against it. He'd warned Westminster, he'd warned the London government that the Stamp Act was going to cause bitter protests, but still, when it was put into effect, he accepted its legality. A Massachusetts mob ransacked his house and destroyed his valuable library, almost tore the place to pieces. In 1770, he became the governor of Massachusetts, and John Adams, obviously soon to be one of the revolutionary leaders, admitted, "Have not his countrymen loved, admired, revered, rewarded, nay, almost adored him? Have not 99 in 100 of them really thought him the greatest and best man in America?" Now, Hutchinson, clearly a widely respected person, thought that the revolutionary leaders, many of whom he knew individually in this small face-to-face world of America in the 1770s, he was struck by their ambition, by their envy, or in the case of people like John Hancock, by their eagerness to be popular and renowned. He thought that many of them had ulterior motives, what he regarded as vulgar motives, for thrusting themselves forward into the political conflict. In the escalating confrontations of 1774-5, he was finally forced to flee under threat after the Boston Tea Party, and he ended his life as an exile in England. Now, when the fighting began in 1775, nearly everybody was forced to take sides, including those who would much rather have preferred to stay out of harm's way. A very good historian, a military historian named John Shy, has estimated that only about a fifth of the people living in the colonies were actively in favour of the revolution. Probably about a fifth were actively opposed to it, and the great majority were just dismayed that it had happened and were eager to keep their heads down and stay out of the way, which is actually what you'd expect when you think of the dangers that are inherent in the outbreak of a revolutionary war. But very often the revolutionary leaders would compel men to join the militia as a way of forcing them to take some kind of direct action which would declare them to be, from the British point of view, in treasonable rebellion against Britain, forcing people to take sides even if they'd rather not. At the end of the fighting, thousands of loyalists left America altogether, where they went to live either back in Britain or in Canada, rather than living in the new republic, though there were many who also made their peace with the new United States and lived out the rest of their lives in the new republic. But what I'd like to emphasise particularly is that there were a lot of them, that they weren't some marginal or freakish group in America, but well-known, widely liked people, interrelated closely with many of the revolutionaries, an important part of the population, who to some extent historians have overlooked. Now, the Constitution, jumping forwards now 10 years, the Constitution was an attempt to make America more stable by strengthening its central government and curbing its radical tendencies. From the time of the Declaration of Independence, the colonies, or the new states, were bound together under the Articles of Confederation. But under the Articles, the central government was very weak, so weak that the Union appeared to be breaking up. There was a chaotic variety of types of money, for example, no universally agreed upon currency. There was great indiscipline in the frontier, constant incursions and raids against the Indians. There was no adequate government leadership from the centre during a commercial slump. And all these problems were brought to a crisis by Shays' Rebellion, an uprising of debtors against their creditors. It was even possible, and it was certainly feared on the part of prescient Americans, that the British might seize the opportunity to reconquer the states, or that the Spanish might make a military expedition, or that a low level of warfare might even break out between squabbling states, and that they'd become chronically permanently at war. These were the circumstances in which the Constitutional Convention gathered in Philadelphia to discuss the possibility of writing a new instrument of government, a new constitution. And the group was given instant prestige by the presence of Washington, George Washington, outstandingly the most famous and most revered man in America, and also by Benjamin Franklin. Now, at that time, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were both working in Europe as ambassadors of the new republic, although they also sympathised with this new venture. And in 1787, at Philadelphia, James Madison drafted and the Founding Fathers hammered out this new instrument of government. I mentioned earlier the historian Charles Beard, who said all these men held government securities. They stood to lose severely by the failure of the Articles of Confederation or the breakdown of the new republic. Charles Beard's work was effective in bringing them down to earth and showing that they were real men with flesh and blood and material interests, not demigods. But still, that doesn't lessen their achievement in any way in creating a very durable constitution, which is still in use now more than 200 years later. It was strong enough to hold the nation together, but it was flexible enough to adapt to new conditions and a transformed world. The Founding Fathers also were not radical Democrats. The whole point about the Senate, which in those days was not popularly elected, but rather had its members appointed by the state governments, and the whole point of the judiciary was that it was designed to be insulation against the electorate. The idea was the electorate is vulnerable to transient passions, and so the Constitution, although it will have a democratic element, the House of Representatives, will also have non-democratic elements, the Senate and the judiciary, to offset them. There was widespread fear of democracy expressed at the Constitutional Convention, because to many of the founders it meant sudden swerves in the transient will of an ignorant mob. For example, one of the delegates, Elbridge Gerry, said, "The evils we experience flow from the excess of democracy, the worst of all political evils." Like many of the founders, he favoured a republic, but not a democracy. There was no assumption at the founding convention that the two go together. To the founders, virtue was much more important than democracy. That's why they created the Electoral College. That's why they had the indirect election of senators, which wasn't switched to direct election until 1913. That's why they favoured the idea of appointing judges and then having them approved by the Senate, rather than making them susceptible to popular election. The House of Representatives was the one democratic element, and the House members had these short 2-year terms so that they could represent the short-term interests of the population. Even that was too much for some of the delegates. Roger Sherman of Connecticut even argued that state legislatures should elect the House of Representatives because he wanted more insulation from democracy. He said, "The people immediately should have as little to do as may be about the government. They want, in other words, they lack information and are constantly liable to be misled." Well, now in practice, the founders accepted slavery, and they agreed not even to raise the question of abolishing the slave trade until 1808. This was a necessary compromise if the Constitution was going to be passed, just as the 3/5 rule, artificially enlarging the population of southern states for purposes of election, was another necessary compromise. Perhaps the most striking way in which the American revolutionaries emphasised their own continuity with their British traditions is the passage of the first 10 amendments. They gave them the same name, the Bill of Rights, as those enumerated rights passed by Parliament 100 years earlier at the end of the Glorious Revolution. So I think it's clear from this that in many respects the American Revolution itself was a very unrevolutionary revolution, and that the people who carried it out were still thinking in terms of what was best in their British heritage.